Alexander the Great never lost a battle. In 13 years of campaigning across 3 continents, he faced every army the ancient world could put in front of him, and destroyed them all. But at the Hydaspes River, in the monsoon swamps of northern India, he came closer to dying than he had in every previous battle combined. And the thing that almost killed him was not the enemy king, it was his own victory. Most people tell this story as a triumph, a clever river crossing, a defeated king, a generous peace. That is the surface reading, and it misses almost everything. Because when you map what actually happened at the Hydaspes, hour by hour, you find a campaign that went wrong from the first hour of crossing, teetered on collapse in the middle, and left Alexander himself holding a sword in a river with no backup and no plan that had survived contact with the enemy. The battle lasted 9 brutal hours. His casualties were the highest since Gaugamela. His most trusted horse died. His men, at the end of it all, refused to march another step east. The greatest tactical mind of the ancient world won the battle and lost everything that came after it. And the reason why starts with 120 war elephants standing at the edge of a flooded river. May 326 BCE. The rain has been falling for 3 days without stopping. Hephaestion stands at the edge of the Macedonian camp on the western bank of the Hydaspes and watches the river. It is not the river he expected. The scouts described it as crossable, wide, but manageable, a seasonal waterway that the army could ford with boats and rafts. What he is looking at now is something else entirely. The monsoon hit 2 weeks early. The current runs brown and violent between the banks, swollen with Himalayan snowmelt and 3 days of tropical rain. A man who falls in does not swim, he disappears. On the far bank, barely visible through the haze, King Porus has arranged his army along the waterline. Not camped, arranged, battle formation. Every morning for 2 weeks, as Alexander's force has probed up and down the river looking for a crossing, Porus has mirrored them step for step. The Indian king understands what the Macedonians need. He is making sure they cannot have it. Somewhere in that line on the eastern bank are the elephants, 130 of them.
Riverbank all week. Every crossing attempt with cavalry ends the same way. The horses rear, throw their riders, scatter back toward camp. The elephants don't even have to move. Their presence alone has made the western bank a dead end. Alexander has been watching all of this from a hilltop above the camp. He has not spoken to his commanders for 2 days. He is thinking. And somewhere in those 2 days of silence, he decided to do something that had never been done before in the history of ancient warfare. Something so patient, so theatrical, and so ruthless that it would take weeks to execute and only one rainy night to unleash. This is the story of how he did it, and what it cost him. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why Hydaspes is different from every other battle Alexander fought. Not because he won, he always won, but because of how close he came to losing, because of what his men had to endure in those 9 hours of fighting, and because of what the victory revealed about the limits of even the greatest military mind the ancient world ever produced. This is the full story of the Battle of the Hydaspes. Every phase, every mistake, every moment. Before we go into every phase of this campaign, every feint, every night march, every catastrophic collision in the elephant lines, if this is the kind of history you want, the real tactics, the terrain, the blood and the mud, and the decisions behind the legend, hit subscribe and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, because this story deserves to be told properly, and that is exactly what we are about to do. To understand why the Hydaspes mattered, you have to understand what Alexander was trying to do, and how impossible it looked to everyone except Alexander himself. By 326 BCE, he had been campaigning for 8 years. He left Macedonia in 334 BCE with roughly 40,000 men, a treasury on the edge of bankruptcy, and a plan to invade the Persian Empire. What followed was one of the most sustained military operations in ancient history. Granicus, Issus, Tyre, a 7-month siege of an island fortress that military historians still use as a case study. Gaugamela, where he destroyed the largest army Persia could field. Egypt, where he was declared a god. Persepolis, where he burned the palace of Xerxes to the ground and watched it light up the sky. Then east, through Bactria, through Afghanistan, through the Hindu Kush mountain range in the dead of winter.
With his men eating their horses to survive. By the time his army crossed into the Indian subcontinent through the Khyber Pass in 327 BCE, they had been fighting continuously for 7 years. And still he was not done. The Punjab region of northwestern India in 326 BCE was a landscape of river systems running roughly north to south. The Indus, the Hydaspes, the Acesines, the Hyphasis. Between each river, dense forest, monsoon-flooded plains, and kingdoms that had not yet decided whether to fight or submit. Alexander had already secured allies. King Taxiles, ruler of the territory between the Indus and the Hydaspes, had agreed to cooperate and even joined Alexander's force with soldiers and supplies. It was a significant gift. It was also a provocation, because Porus, ruler of the kingdom east of the Hydaspes, the next river in line, was Taxiles' rival, and the moment Alexander marched into Taxiles' territory as an ally, Porus knew he was next. Porus chose to fight. That decision tells you something important about the man. Every other king in the region, from Bactria to the Punjab, had either submitted to Alexander or fled before he arrived. Porus looked at the army that had destroyed the Persian Empire and decided to meet it in the field. He was not reckless. He had thought this through. The river was his weapon. He would let Alexander exhaust himself trying to cross, bleed the Macedonian cavalry in the water, and meet whatever made it across with a force anchored by war elephants that the Macedonian horses could not withstand. It was a sound strategy. On paper, it should have worked. But here is what Porus did not fully account for. Alexander had 17 miles of riverbank to work with, weeks of preparation time, and a capacity for deception that Porus was only beginning to understand. We need to stop here and address something that almost every popular account of the Hydaspes gets wrong. The crossing is usually presented as a single brilliant stroke. Alexander finds a secret ford 17 miles upstream, crosses in the dark, surprises Porus and wins. Clean, decisive, genius made simple. At night, Macedonian cavalry would ride to the riverbank with torches and war cries, as if a crossing attempt was imminent. The first night, Porus responded immediately. His army moved to the threatened point, formed up, waited. Nothing happened. The second night, the same performance, the same response from Porus. The third night, the fourth, the fifth. Every time, Porus moved. Every time, nothing followed. And then, gradually, inevitably, Porus stopped sending his full army. He began dispatching smaller detachments to monitor the disturbances. His scouts started treating the nightly cavalry movements as routine. The alarm that should have triggered a maximum response had been worn down to background noise. This is the part that military historians point to as Alexander's real genius at the Hydaspes. Not the crossing itself, the conditioning that made the crossing possible. He spent weeks making his enemy comfortable with the sight of his army moving at night. When he finally moved for real, Porus had been trained to dismiss it. There is also the question of the decoy. When Alexander slipped away upstream with his strike force on the night of the crossing, he left behind a senior officer named Attalus, dressed in Alexander's royal cloak and armor, moving visibly through the camp. From the eastern bank, through the rain and the dark, Porus's scouts would have seen the royal cloak still in place. The king, as far as they could tell, had not moved. So when dawn broke and reports came back of a large Macedonian force crossing 17 miles upstream, the first instinct in Porus's camp was not panic, it was confusion. Because the king was still in camp, wasn't he? By the time the confusion resolved, Alexander was already across. The night Alexander chose for the crossing was not chosen randomly. He had been watching the weather. He needed rain and thunder to cover the sound of 10,000 men moving through the dark, dragging boats and rafts across mud and undergrowth for 17 miles. The monsoon gave him his window. A storm rolled in from the northwest on a night in May. Accounts vary on the exact date, and Alexander moved. the force he took was not his entire army. Under his second-in-command Craterus, stayed in camp on the western bank with orders to cross only when Porus was fully committed to the battle upstream. The march itself was brutal, 17 miles through monsoon darkness, with animals that couldn't be allowed to make noise, equipment that couldn't be dropped, and terrain that turned to mud under 40,000 boots and hooves. They moved in near silence, which is to say they moved in the kind of controlled, grinding, exhausted near silence that soldiers understand and civilian accounts never fully capture. Men slipped, equipment was dropped and retrieved, the horses had to be calmed constantly. They reached the crossing point before dawn. And that is where the plan started to unravel. The scouts had identified the crossing point as a bend in the river with an island dividing the channel. The plan was to use the island as a staging point, get across the first channel, use the island for cover, then cross the second, narrower channel to the eastern bank. What the scouts had not fully communicated, or what had not been fully understood, was the size of the island and the depth of the second channel after weeks of monsoon rain. Alexander's force crossed the first channel in the dark, without significant trouble. They landed on the island. And then, in the grey pre-dawn light, the men in the lead elements looked at the second channel and understood they had a problem. It was not a narrow crossing. It was chest deep in the current, fast, and there were no boats on this side. The boats and rafts were being used for the first crossing. Dawn was coming. Porus's scouts were already active. If they were spotted on the island, half in and half out of the operation, the entire plan was over. Alexander did not pause to consult his commanders. He ordered the men into the water. They waded across in formation, shields held above their heads, cavalry swimming their horses beside them, the current pulling at their legs, men going under and being hauled back up by the men beside them. The infantry made it across with water up to their chests and their shoulders. They climbed out on the eastern bank soaking wet, weapons still in hand, and formed up as fast as they could move. Porus's scouts saw them. Force was organized enough to fight. He sent his son, the son of Porus, also named Porus, which tells you something about how these dynasties thought about succession, was given 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots, and told to intercept the crossing force at the river and pin it before it could form up. It was not an unreasonable decision. If the crossing force was still disorganized, still climbing out of the water with wet equipment and scattered formations, 2,000 cavalry could hit it and hold it until the main army arrived. What the Indian cavalry rode into was not what they expected. Alexander had used the time it took Porus's son to reach the bank to assemble his force in full. His cavalry was formed, his infantry was moving into position, and the ground near the riverbank, churned to mud by weeks of rain, and now by the crossing itself, was giving Porus's chariots a catastrophic problem. Chariots are a weapon built for speed and firm ground. You need traction for the wheels, you need clear going for the horses. What the Indian chariot force rolled into at the Hydaspes was a field of deep mud, standing water, and uneven terrain that brought their vehicles to a near standstill before they could build momentum. Wheels sank, horses churned and struggled, formations that should have been a wall of moving iron and wood turned into a traffic problem. Alexander's horse archers did not wait for an invitation. They swept in along the flanks of the stalled chariots and began to work, raking the confused formation with arrows, targeting horses and drivers, keeping the chariots from reorganizing. Porus's son committed his cavalry in response, trying to cover the chariots and drive the archers back. That was the opening Alexander had been waiting for. The companion cavalry hit them head on. This is where accounts of the battle get sparse and confusing. The ancient sources describe a hard cavalry fight without great tactical detail, which probably means it was the kind of messy, close, brutal engagement that does not produce clean narratives. What we know is the outcome. Porus's son was killed in the fighting. His cavalry broke and fled back toward the main army. The chariots, still 20 and 30,000. Accounts vary, and ancient casualty figures are notoriously unreliable, but the scale is clear. He had several thousand cavalry, organized on both flanks. His chariots were gone, destroyed upstream in the mud, but he had something that more than compensated: 130 war elephants. Porus arranged them across the front of his infantry line at intervals of roughly 50 feet, close enough to present a continuous barrier, far enough apart that infantry could shelter between them. From the front, it looked like the most formidable defensive line Alexander had ever faced. Not a wall of shields, a wall of living creatures, each one weighing several tons, each one capable of breaking a phalanx formation the way a foot breaks an anthill. The psychological effect on Alexander's infantry cannot be overstated. These men had fought Persians, Bactrians, Scythians, and every other army the Eastern world could produce. They had broken the famous Persian immortals. They had held together under cavalry charges that lesser armies would have fled from. But they had never faced war elephants in numbers like this. Individual elephants, yes. Darius had a handful at Gaugamela, and they had been neutralized before they reached the Macedonian line. This was different. This was an elephant corps, trained and deployed as a weapons system, and it was standing between Alexander and the rest of India. Alexander took one look at the line and understood that a direct assault on the elephant front was not an option. His cavalry horses would not approach. His phalanx, even if it charged, would be broken apart by the animals before it could push through. He needed to destroy the elephant threat without letting the elephants dictate the engagement. And he needed to do it while fighting outnumbered, with only his strike force, while the rest of his army was still on the other side of the river. He had probably been thinking about this problem for weeks. He began with a feint. The Macedonian formation that faced Porus across the plain was not the standard deployment Alexander used in most of his battles. He had adapted it specifically for what he knew he was about to face. His infantry, the phalanx and the Hydaspes, took the center. But Alexander kept them back, deliberately out of range of immediate engagement. In this battle was not to hold a line, but to kill elephant handlers, specifically, kill the mahouts. A war elephant without a trained rider is not a weapon. It is a panic attack in motion. Remove the mahout. The man seated behind the animal's head, who steers and controls it with voice commands, pressure signals, and a long-handled iron goad, and the elephant has no direction. It has only its own terror, its own pain, and the instinct to escape whatever is hurting it, which, in the middle of a battle, means it will run, and it will not run away from the battle. It will run through whatever is nearest to it, which is usually its own side. Alexander had identified this as the key vulnerability of the elephant corps weeks before the battle. The light infantry, distributed through his formation, were not there to fight the elephants. They were there to create an army of unguided missiles out of Porus's greatest asset. He opened the battle with his cavalry on the right, sweeping hard toward Porus's left flank. Not to break through, to pull. He needed Porus to move cavalry from one side, to reinforce the other, to create a gap on the right flank that his second cavalry wing could exploit. The gamble was that Porus would respond predictably. Porus did. The Indian cavalry shifted from the right flank toward the left to meet Alexander's pressure, and on the far side of the field, Coenus, one of Alexander's most experienced and trusted commanders, a general who had been with the campaign since Macedonia, had been waiting for exactly this moment with the second Macedonian cavalry wing. The moment Porus's right flank thinned, Coenus swung wide, looped behind the line in a wide arc, and came in from the rear. Porus's cavalry, caught between Alexander's pressure from the front and Coenus hitting them from behind, had nowhere to go. They wheeled toward the center of their own formation, seeking cover, seeking space, seeking anything but the cavalry hammering them from two directions. And in doing so, they drove themselves directly into the elephant line. What happened next in the center of the battle is one of the most chaotic and terrible hours of fighting in the ancient
that Alexander had been so careful to keep back. Into the shields and the spears and the screaming men who had never had to deal with something like this before. The phalanx broke in places. Not in the sense of fleeing, these were the best infantry in the world and they did not run. But the tight, disciplined formation that made the Macedonian phalanx invincible against human opponents could not hold its shape against animals weighing 4 tons apiece moving at speed through the middle of it. Men were thrown. Men were crushed. Men were impaled on steel-fitted tusks or trampled under feet the size of millstones. The screaming of the elephants mixed with the screaming of men and the screaming of horses and produced a noise that ancient sources describe as unlike anything they had ever heard on a battlefield. Imagine being a Macedonian soldier in that moment. You have crossed a flooded river in the dark. You have fought a cavalry engagement in the mud. You have marched and assembled and held your position through the opening movements of the battle. And now something that weighs 4,000 pounds and cannot be reasoned with is walking through the formation you have trained your entire life to hold. The man on your left has just disappeared. The man on your right is trying to drive his spear into the animal's flank and the spear is snapping. There is nowhere to move because your formation is your survival, and your formation no longer exists in the space around you. This is what Hydaspes cost. Not the river. Not the night march. Alexander's light infantry went to work. Javelins, arrows, and spears targeted the mahouts specifically. One by one, the handlers began to fall. An elephant whose mahout was killed would stagger, slow, begin to spin in confusion. When enough of the handlers were dead or wounded, the elephants began to turn. Not all at once in groups, then individually, then in a wave of panicked motion that swept back through the Indian infantry formations with the same destructive force that had just torn through the Macedonian line. Porus infantry, already under pressure from the phalanx in front of them, now had elephants running through them from behind. The Indian formations collapsed. Not in retreat, in chaos. Men trying to get away from their own animals, from the Macedonian spears in front, from the cavalry closing in on the flanks. There was nowhere to go. And now Craterus crossed. On the western bank, Craterus had been watching the battle develop, waiting for the signal that Porus was fully committed. When the Indian king marched his entire army north to meet Alexander's crossing force, the western bank was lightly guarded. Craterus brought the rest of the Macedonian army across the river, formed them up, and advanced from behind. The hammer was in front. The anvil arrived from the rear. The encirclement was complete. What followed was not a battle. It was a closing of the ring. The Indian army, fighting in 3 directions simultaneously, with elephants running through their own formations, lost all cohesion. The cavalry that had sheltered among the elephants was now caught between Macedonian horsemen on every side. The infantry, without its flanking protection and without space to maneuver, began to take catastrophic losses. 9 hours after Alexander's cavalry first struck Porus' left flank, the Indian army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. But Porus had not surrendered. For hours after the outcome was no longer in doubt, after his cavalry had broken, after his infantry had collapsed, after his son lay dead somewhere in the mud upstream, Porus remained in the field. He was mounted on the largest elephant in his corps. He had taken multiple wounds, and he continued to fight, directing what remained of his command, until there was nothing left to direct. Alexander saw him from across the shrinking battlefield. He had fought kings before. He had never seen one who refused to leave. He sent an envoy, a man named Maros who Porus knew personally, to ask the Indian king to stand down. Porus descended from his elephant. He asked for water. He was brought before Alexander. Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus looked at the man who had just destroyed his army and said, "As a king." Alexander restored him to his throne. He expanded his territory. It was the single most generous act Alexander performed toward a defeated enemy in his entire campaign. Military historians have argued for centuries about what it reveals about him. What it definitely reveals is that he recognized something in Porus that he had not seen since he faced Darius, and Darius had fled both times. Porus stayed. That meant something to Alexander in a way that is difficult to fully articulate and impossible to ignore. The cost of the Hydaspes was real. Macedonian casualties at the battle are estimated at somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 dead, with significantly more wounded. Those numbers are disputed. Ancient sources are unreliable and tend to minimize friendly losses, but the scale of the fighting in the elephant lines makes clear that this was not a clean engagement. Alexander's men had endured something at the Hydaspes that they had not endured before. Not just physical danger, though there was plenty of that. Something more corrosive. The feeling of a plan that almost came apart. The memory of men being thrown and crushed and impaled by weapons that could not be reasoned with or flanked or outmaneuvered. And then there was Bucephalus, the horse that had carried Alexander since he was a boy, the black stallion that no one else could ride, that he had tamed at 12 years old by recognizing that the animal was simply afraid of its own. Shadow died in the days after the battle. He was old. He had carried Alexander from Macedonia to the edge of India. The Hydaspes may have been too much for him, or the years simply caught up in the aftermath. Alexander was, by every account, devastated in a way that military success could not address. He founded a city on the eastern bank and named it after the horse, Bucephala. It was still there centuries later. But grief had no room in what came next, because the scouts were coming back with reports about what lay east of the Hydaspes, and what they were describing was not a collection of small kingdoms that could be absorbed and subdued. They were describing the Nanda Empire, a force that, by ancient estimates, could put hundreds of thousands of infantry and thousands of war elephants in the field. Larger than anything Alexander had yet faced. Larger than Persia. Larger than the Punjab kingdoms combined. Alexander wanted to keep going. He summoned his commanders and gave them the speech he always gave, the speech about glory, about destiny, about the edge of the known world being just one more river crossing away. He had given versions of this speech at the Granicus, at the Persian gates, in the Bactrian winter when his men were eating their horses. It had always worked. At the Hydaspes River it did not work. His officers, led by a general named Caenus, the same Caenus who had executed the decisive cavalry swing that broke Porus' right flank, told him the truth. The men were done. Not demoralized. Not cowardly. Done. 8 years into a campaign that had taken them from Greece to the edge of India, their equipment worn through, their friends buried from the Aegean to the Punjab, their families half a world away, they had reached the end of what any human group of soldiers can sustain on will and discipline. Alone. Caenus spoke for all of them. He was a general who had never failed Alexander, never questioned a plan, never hesitated at a river crossing or a mountain pass or a fortified city. His voice shook when he spoke, or so the sources say. It is the kind of detail that ancient historians add to moments they want you to remember. Alexander went to his tent and did not come out for 3 days. When he emerged, he announced that he was turning the army around. He framed it as a response to divine signs, to the omens from the sacrifices his seers had been reading. Nobody believed that explanation. Everyone accepted it. The army had earned its way home. He never marched east again. The return journey was not a comfortable victory lap. Marching south down the Indus Valley, Alexander led an assault on a fortified city of the Malians, a tribe that had refused to submit, and went over the walls himself before his bodyguards could follow. An arrow hit him in the chest.
Pierce da lung.
He collapsed inside the city walls while his men were still trying to get over the ramparts and reach him. He survived. Barely. The Macedonian soldiers who heard the rumor that he was dead went briefly insane with grief and rage, and the Malians paid an enormous price for it. When Alexander was carried out alive on a stretcher, half his army wept. That is the kind of hold he had on them. Even the men who refused to march one more step east would have followed him into a burning building. Alexander reached Babylon in 323 BCE. He had been campaigning for 13 years. He was 32 years old. In June of that year, after a banquet and several days of fever that his physicians could not break, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. The cause has been debated for 2,000 years. Typhoid, complicated by the lung wound from the Malian city. Alcohol-related organ failure. Poison, administered by enemies who had survived long enough to get close. We do not know. We probably never will. His generals gathered around the bed and asked who should inherit the empire. He said, to the strongest. Within a generation, everything he built had been divided into 3 competing kingdoms, each ruled by a successor general who spent decades fighting the others. The empire did not survive. The cities he founded, more than 70 of them, scattered from Egypt to Afghanistan, survived for centuries. Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Kandahar, which he founded as Alexandria of the Aracosians, still exists today. Bucephala, named for a horse, was swallowed by the landscape within a few centuries. Here is the question that the Hydaspes raises that nobody has ever fully answered. Alexander won that battle. Decisively. He crossed an impossible river, destroyed a superior defensive position, neutralized a weapon system designed specifically to stop him, and did it with fewer men than Porus commanded. By every tactical and strategic measure, it was one of the most impressive performances of his career. And it broke something in his army that 9 previous years of campaigning had not broken. Not their courage, not their discipline, not their loyalty. It broke their willingness to keep going. And that raises a question about Alexander that military historians and psychologists have circled for centuries without resolving. Was he, by 326 BCE, fighting for something that his men could no longer understand? Was the vision of reaching the Eastern Ocean, of standing at the edge of the known world and claiming it, a goal that existed only inside his own head, something that had meaning to him and had long since stopped having meaning to anyone else? The men who refused to cross the Hydaspes were not wrong. They were not weak, failing their commander. They were human beings who had been pushed past the edge of what human beings can endure, and they were honest about it in a way that Alexander, who may not have had that kind of edge, could never be. There is something almost tragic about that moment at the Hydaspes. The greatest conqueror in history, standing at the edge of the world he dreamed of reaching, turned back not by a river or an army or 100 war elephants or a fortified city, but by the limits of ordinary human endurance. By the fact that the men who loved him most could not follow him into the infinite the way he could follow himself. He turned around. He went home. He died at 32 in a palace in Babylon, in the bed of a king he had destroyed. And the world he built lasted long enough to change history, then fell apart exactly as fast as it had been assembled. Undefeated in battle, unmatched in strategy, and ultimately unable to outlast the ambition that made him who he was. That is the real story of the Hydaspes. Not the river crossing, not the elephants, not the generous peace with Porus. The real story is what the victory cost, and what it revealed about the man who won it. If you made it this far, you already know what to do. But history does not end here. Watch the next video now.